In the last lecture, our hero was Hercules, and his act was fatal for the centaur and fateful for him. We explored the whole story right up through its grisly finish, trying to see what this particular episode might have meant for the audience in the 15th century Florence, and we speculated about what it might say to us. That particular subject isn't well known nowadays, but this picture, our topic today, shows one of the best known episodes in the New Testament. What happened to Saul on the road to Damascus? That road is so familiar it's become a figure of speech. What happened on the road was critical to this hero's life, but he's a different kind of hero from Hercules. Again, we're going to look carefully at what the artist represented and how, and we'll ask why, and we'll see what significance all of this might possibly have for us today. First, let's just look at the picture for a minute or two, side by side, up and down, just observing, and after that time I'll start talking again. Saul is shown as young, or in maybe early middle age. He lies on the ground and twists his body around, his mouth open in amazement, his curly hair streaming behind him. His fancy plumed helmet on the lower left has fallen off, but sits there quite neatly on the ground. He wears Roman military costume. His bright red cloak billows up behind him and seems sort of suspended in the air. His horse has fallen to his knees and seems beginning to rise, and he twists his neck to look up. Both of them are looking at Christ, who's emerging from the clouds, holding a little banner of the type that we see Christ carrying in pictures of the resurrection or of his appearances right afterward. He looks calmly at Saul and he points into the distance. In the background is a town perched on a hill and some mountain crags in the far distance. At the bottom of the hill, a road crosses along it, and men on foot and horseback, dressed as soldiers, are running and falling, going every which way in confusion. They're evidently reacting to the same apparition because a couple of them hold up shields to protect themselves. At the right is a row of big trees that are closely spaced. The road that Saul and his horse have been traveling snakes back and disappears out of the picture at the right, suggesting that the horse and the rider must have emerged from dense woods. I should say now that since we're observing closely that this painting does not present the problems of condition that the Polaiolo does and that I talked about, we don't have to be as tentative in what we say about it. In fact, it looks pretty much as it was intended to. The picture was not well known at all until 5 years ago, when it was bought for Yale at the recommendation of the curator, now chief curator, Lawrence Cantor. That took a keen eye and some courage, since it looked like this. When it came to Ian McClure's conservation studio, it was covered with yellowed varnish, and being painted on a wood panel, it had suffered some losses from the cracks, some of which you see, and also from flaking. But flaking is a very different matter from the seriously overcleaned state of the Pollaiuolo. There, most of the top layer of modeling was lost, which is much more disfiguring and more misleading about what the artist intended. So Ian McClure's problem was quite different from the problem faced by the restorer, the Garofalo. He did a very deft and tidy job of diminishing the distractions caused by the damages, and he didn't need to do very much more than that. One more thing. The Yale picture once had a companion piece of about the same size, a picture that's now in the Galleria Borghese in Rome, that was most likely commissioned by the same person and most likely hung together with it. The subject of this one is the calling of Christ by, the calling of St. Peter by Christ. Peter, the other leading figure of the early church, the former fisherman whom Christ designated as the first pope. The two subjects make a logical pairing. Peter and Paul are common twosome, in fact, in Christian art. The heights of the panels are about the same, but when I show them this way, you can see that the painting of Peter on the left is not as wide. It's evidently been cut at the left. We seldom know exactly why these things happen, but it's usually to make the picture fit some prized carved and gilded picture frame that an owner or dealer had on hand. I want to talk for just a little while about the painter, Benvenuto Tisi, nicknamed Garofalo. He's supposed to have been born in the town by that name, near Rovigo, between Ferrara and Padua in the Po Delta. The locals have claimed him for Rovigo, and there are reminders of him here and there, a bust portrait in the park on the left, a signpost for his house, and the rather disappointing building that it leads to. The artist was born about, and brought up, I should say, born in Rovigo, but brought up about 30 miles to the south in Ferrara, the capital city of a prosperous dukedom ruled by the Este dynasty, Ercole d'Este, and his son Alfonso, spouse of Lucrezia Borgia. These were the rulers in Garofalo's lifetime. Here on the right is the Este Castle, now thoroughly restored, and on the left, one of the dozens of palaces built during the 15th and 16th centuries for the Estes and other rich families. This one is now the museum, in fact, where the largest group of Garofalo's work is to be seen. Ferrara was a kind of smaller version of Florence under the Medici. Money and ducal generosity made it a magnet for all kinds of scholars and musicians, and also for a certain kind of painter and sculptor. Not the most brilliant or ambitious, like Pollaiuolo or Botticelli, let alone Michelangelo, but artists more quirky and precious. There was generous patronage for them and a lot of bare walls in new chapels and palaces and churches to decorate. Garofalo was apprenticed to a local painter in this relatively conservative milieu, and then he went to Cremona to work under this artist, Boccaccio Boccaccino, on the right. His work of the period looks a lot like his master's, as you will admit, and as these Madonnas show you, the master on the right, the apprentice on the left. His skill at taking up the styles of other artists would not have been considered a fault at all at this period, but the opposite, an advantage. It was actually part of one's apprenticeship. This is more obvious even after he goes to Venice, where he encountered pictures by Giorgione and the young Titian, Titian at the bottom. Pictures that had a subtler kind of light and a poetic feeling, something he'd never encountered, a more fluid way of painting, and the imagery he took away with him. Their looser, freer, and more suggestive painting technique, on the other hand, he never tried to adopt. Soon, Garofalo was painting pagan subjects for the sophisticated Este court, using bigger figures in sculptural poses, like the two deities on the left. And he also had become a master of the calmer, more conservative painting styles in Venice, as you can also see from this altarpiece on the right. His Nativity of 1513, I'm sorry for the angle from which it's shot and the light it's shot in. This is a gallery with windows that make problems for amateur photographers like me. Sometime after painting this picture, Garofalo must have gone to Rome. The biographer Vasari says he did, but if he hadn't said so, we'd know that anyway. Rome was where the greatest project in the entire history of painting was being carried out just then. Raphael and his huge team of assistants had been at work painting for Pope Julius II in the Vatican Palace, and Michelangelo, almost by himself, had painted the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. We don't know just what Garofalo did there in Rome, but he must have spent time in front of the brand new frescoes in the Papal Palace, some of which were still underway, and under that ceiling of Michelangelo's that he just finished painting. It was in the great stanze painted by Raphael, like this one, as well as the older pieces of Raphael that taught Garofalo the most, and they gave him new equipment for his own work. Nothing quite like these men in the School of Athens by Raphael had ever been seen. This combination of convincing weight, easy mobility, mental and physical energy, and deep seriousness. Those were frescoes, of course. Raphael also painted altarpieces in oil, like this one on the left, which Garofalo could have seen and surely did see and absorb the warm luminosity that he knew already from Venetian painting, but Raphael did not sacrifice to clarity or strict discipline. Anyway, Garofalo returned to Ferrara with new strength and new ambition, ready to work in the new, powerful, classicizing style that he'd studied here in Rome. He became a kind of Raphaelite, a translator of Raphael's big ideas into a milder language. He used it for altarpieces, commissioned for churches, and for a great many small, exquisitely painted pictures for private buyers. And this is where the Yale painting more or less fits into Garofalo's practice. Now, he wasn't the first. Raphael also worked in small format. This little St. George by Raphael was painted for the Duke of Urbino, but Raphael and his team of assistants did not make a vigorous sideline of this practice. This was going to be Garofalo's particular genius and his stock in trade. Garofalo also worked on a large scale, where he shows a lot of Raphael's confident breadth of conception, what was called his grandezza, and something of Raphael's easy elegance, his sprezzatura. In this altarpiece on the right that Garofalo painted after he returned from Rome, you can see how he's absorbed the Madonna del Foligno on the left, not just in format and in layout, but in something a lot more difficult. He's got a good deal of the fluid grace of the Madonna and the infant as well. At his best, even when his compositions aren't exactly eloquent, Garofalo can pack a lot of intensity into a small space and some gorgeous saturated color, as he does with this circumcision in the Louvre. There are also many altarpieces I mentioned by Garofalo. He was the premier painter of the city for more than 30 years. And there are surprises, too. Around the time he painted the Yale conversion of Saul, he carried out a large fresco for the refectory of the monastery of San Agostino in Ferrara. It's been transferred to canvas, and it's the first thing you see by Garofalo as you come into the museum upstairs in the Palazzo dei Diamanti in Ferrara. If you've been thinking of Garofalo and expecting him to be mainly a painter of small pictures, this one sort of shakes you up. And also the 9 altarpieces in the museum do the same. The subject here is the Christian church called Ecclesia, and the Jewish synagoga, you could say the Old Testament and the New Testament. There is no real narrative, but there is instead a kind of invented allegory and a kind of diagram of how Christianity works, which had to be devised or at least supervised by one or more learned priests. On either side of the cross here, the church, who directs a stream of blood from Christ's hand towards the priests who are performing the sacraments, and the synagogue on the right-hand side of the cross is in the form of an old woman sitting on a donkey, riding it backwards, with the crumbling Temple of Jerusalem at the far right. At the upper left is the great teacher of these matters, none other than St. Paul, who expounded the belief that the New Testament fulfilled the prophecies of the Old Testament and superseded it. Paul was an inspiration to St. Augustine, the founder of the religious order that commissioned this painting. Augustine wrote that Paul's epistles caused him to change his life. Here, Paul looks almost as though he and his listeners could have stepped out of Raphael's frescoes in the Vatican stanze. Well, between dozens of large altarpieces for churches and many small devotional paintings for private buyers, Garofalo was a very busy man for 25 more years until he went blind in 1550. He must have had a good-sized and active workshop, because the paintings are sometimes ambitious, almost never innovative, usually beautifully made with glowing color and rich surfaces, and often a lot of extras to look at, as for example the little still life in the foreground of the Adoration of the Magi, with not only the crown here, but the little rocks on a little butte, mesa or whatever, and a little carnation growing out of the ground, a Garofano, by the way, a play on the artist's name, and a teeny weeny scroll with the artist's name and date, with the date, 1537. The quality of these small pictures varies quite a lot. The best of them have a marvelous finesse and an almost Flemish richness of oil technique. Many of them are less refined, however. Quite a few were replicas of compositions by Garofalo, by studio hands, or minor variants, painted to suit the wishes of a patron who might pick the subject or just have her own patron saint included in the picture, like this little one here, in which, undoubtedly ordered by someone called Katharina, who's pictured there as St. Catherine in the Holy Family. There was a particular vogue for Ferrarese painters among later 16th century collectors in Rome, who evidently prized their intimacy, their craftsmanship, much as they did the Dutch and Flemish paintings that they were also importing from the lowlands. In Rome last year, I went looking in the 5 major public galleries and saw no less than 45 pictures by Garofalo, or attributed to him. There are about 200 known. Among the late works are a few surprises, like this one. It's a return to our subject 20 years later, and now everything is different. The soldiers are packed together while Saul and his horse go down together, twisting away in opposite directions. Saul here is huge by comparison, heavily muscled, bearded. Christ in the background at the top here is not giving a command, but instead letting light, the light of grace, pour down on the scene like a waterfall. Garofalo never stops borrowing. The pose that he gives Saul here is based on that of none other than Attila the Hun, at the right on the fresco by 1514 by Raphael in the Vatican. The composition is something very strange, jam-packed, very consciously artful. In fact, many people who saw it, I think, would know pretty much right away where Garofalo had gone in order to bring himself up to date artistically to Mantua, not far away, where Giulio Romano, the former assistant to Raphael, had spoken the last word in this kind of borderline ludicrous excess. This was painted for the Duke's banqueting house and portrays the jam-packed helter-skelter of the fall of the giants that's described in the Metamorphoses of Ovid after Jupiter, who's up in the dome, we can't see him here, up in the dome, had thrown one of his thunderbolts. I'm ending this quick survey of the career of Garofalo with his two versions of the conversion of Saul. It's time to say a little more about what Garofalo had to work with. Two things, basically. What the New Testament had to say about this event, the text, and how artists had portrayed that subject earlier, the visual tradition. Paul gave his own version of this story, explaining how he, a Jew, could possibly have joined that heretical sect of Christians. I'll read from the Acts of the Apostles, chapter 22, where he's addressing an angry crowd of Jews in Jerusalem after he'd returned there. "Brothers and fathers," says Paul, "brothers and fathers, listen to my defense that I now make to you." And when they heard that, when he heard that he was addressing them in Aramaic, they became quieter. Then Paul said, "I am a Jew, born in Tarsus in Cilicia, but brought up in this city, educated with strictness under Gamaliel the rabbi, according to the law of our ancestors, and was zealous for God just as all of you are today. I persecuted Christians even to the point of death, tying up both men and women and putting them in prison, as both the high priest and the whole council of elders can testify about me. From them I also received letters to the brothers in Damascus, and I was on my way to make arrests there and bring the prisoners to Jerusalem to be punished. As I was en route and near Damascus, about noon, a very bright light from heaven suddenly flashed around me. Then I fell to the ground and heard a voice saying to me, 'Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?' I answered, 'Who are you, Lord?' He said to me, 'I am Jesus the Nazarene, whom you are persecuting.' Those who were with me," this is Paul again, "those who were with me saw the light, but did not understand the voice of the one who was speaking to me. So I asked, 'What should I do, Lord?' The Lord said to me, 'Get up and go to Damascus. There you will be told about everything that you have been designated to do.' Since I couldn't see because of the brilliance of the light, I came to Damascus, led by the hand of those who were with me. A man called Ananias, a devout man according to the law, well spoken of all by the Jews who lived there, came to me and stood beside me and said, 'Brother Saul, regain your sight.' And at that moment, I looked up and saw him. Then he said, 'The God of our ancestors has already chosen you to know his will, to see the righteous one, to hear a command from his mouth, because you will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and have your sins washed away, calling on his name.'" I'll recapitulate and just add some details. Saul, as he said, was a Jew who was born around the time of Christ's birth in Tarsus in eastern Turkey today, which was a busy Hellenistic seaport, part of the Roman province of Syria. His first language was Greek, and he was a Roman citizen. His family belonged to the Jewish diaspora, and they then returned to Jerusalem, where Saul was educated in a kind of temple college. For most of his life, he was a tent maker by trade. He belonged to the Pharisee party and was evidently a strict believer in Jewish tradition and his scriptures. He described himself later on as the best Jew and the best Pharisee of his generation. And until middle age, Saul was a zealous persecutor of the new heretical sect, the Christians. He went from synagogue to synagogue trying to sniff out Christian converts, get them to commit blasphemy, and he sent many of them to prison and voted for their execution. He was even a witness at the stoning to death of St. Stephen. After he was baptized, Saul the persecutor became Paul the evangelical preacher. He traveled and taught all over the Roman world, particularly Asia Minor and Greece. Here on the left, Raphael shows him preaching to the Gentiles in Athens, and he had miraculous powers. In the painting on the right, you see Paul, after his shipwreck on Malta, bitten by a viper and amazing the crowd by showing no ill effects. Most important, he wrote letters to the congregations that he had founded or strengthened, which became the Epistles of the New Testament. These letters elucidated the Old Testament, and they interpreted Christ's teaching, and they became fundamental to the early church. He met Peter and the other disciples in Jerusalem and came to an agreement dividing responsibility with them. Paul's assignment, with the help of Barnabas, was to convert the non-Jews of the Greco-Roman world, the Gentiles. So, how should we think about this image of Saul's conversion? I mean, what we see is Saul being chosen. Saul about to change his life completely. From the time of Paul's teachings until the Protestant Reformation, his conversion was seen as an act of grace, something given to him. Saul didn't earn it. The opposite was true. He'd been focusing his tremendous energy and intelligence on exterminating the new Christian sect. Now he'd devote those same qualities to building up that sect, and he'd do that better than anyone had before or since. If we look at the calling of Peter together with this picture, as I think we were meant to do, we have two unexpected turnabouts. Simon the fisherman, an ordinary, uneducated man just trying to make a living, gets the call and becomes the leader of the church, what Christ called the rock on which the church is built. And Saul, who prided himself, as you heard, on being the worst enemy of that church, became its main advocate and teacher. For Christians, the message was that the power of Christ is irresistible. You can't predict whom he'll choose or why. And here are the two pillars of the church, Peter and Paul, both chosen by grace, not because they deserved to be chosen or because they professed faith, but because they were given this gift. The medieval church taught that the conversion of St. Paul was such an important event that a feast day was created for it, January 25th, which is still observed. The reasons were given by a 13th century bishop who compiled the lives of the saints in a collection called the Golden Legend, as follows. This conversion proves to us that there is no sinner who might not hope for the grace which he needs. Further, the church rejoiced more over the conversion of St. Paul than she had been afflicted by his persecutions. Finally, this conversion was more of a miracle than the other conversions of saints, since God showed by it that he could convert his cruelest prosecutor and make of him his most loyal apostle. All right, is that all there is? I mean, if we're not Christian, is there a message for us in this story anyway? I'd say yes. I mean, for starters, it's a reminder that things change, sometimes unimaginably, that no matter how confident we may be in the rightness of what we're doing, we could be completely turned around without warning. And pride may indeed go before a fall. That's some of the power of the image here. The normal relationship is that man sits securely on his horse. That's the true order of things. In ordinary experience, there's such a thing as command, and there's submission. There's up and there's down. Here, however, it's not secure any longer. There's no more command. The horse and rider are suddenly equally prostrate and equally ignorant. To see more of what Garofalo brought to the subject of Saul's conversion, which is quite a lot, it helps to look at how the subject has been treated by other artists. There are a lot of examples. They make a little textbook on storytelling techniques. So I'm going to spend a little more time than normal on the subject. But one thing that strikes you here is that there's nobody watching. There's a confused crowd, Paul's companions, in the far background. That corresponds to the mention in the Acts of Apostles that the men that were traveling with him stood speechless. They heard the voice but could see no one. In some pictures of the previous century, there's no crowd at all. In this Italian miniature on the left from a manuscript, it's God the Father who appears, not instead of Christ. But that's unusual, and we actually don't see the bearded God the Father again, as far as I know. What is remarkable is that the artist makes Saul more familiar to his audience by showing him as a late medieval soldier, a contemporary, in full suit of armor, mounted on a horse, whose leaping pose, by the way, you recognize as the same one as his contemporary Polaiolo had given to Nessus, the centaur. Anyway, I should point out that nowhere in the Bible is Saul identified as a soldier or riding on a horse. Saul was working under the authority of the high priest. He wasn't in the Roman army or any other army. He was a tent maker, and he probably didn't ride a horse the 90 miles from Jerusalem to Damascus. These are all the artist's inventions. In the German panel on the right, Saul is wearing up-to-date German costume that isn't specifically military, and he has no sword or armor at all. He's knocked backward by Christ. He's literally turned around in the saddle. Some artists show Saul without a horse. For example, this Sienese painter on the left of the 1380s. We can tell that the men are all Roman soldiers, despite their medieval costumes, because of their shields with SPQR emblazoned on them. Christ sends down a kind of hailstorm of light rays, and he seems to knock Saul over with the words that he shouts in Latin, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" Well, lest the viewer have any doubt who that is on the ground, he has a huge sword, which for centuries had been Paul's attribute, the conventional prop that identifies a saint, in this case, the instrument of his eventual martyrdom. Typical of landscapes in Sienese paintings, this one uses the hill to emphasize Saul's collapse by kind of dipping down behind him. A century later, on the right, the great Luca Signorelli also put soldiers in contemporary military costume, and he gave them an eloquent, if stagey, poses of shock and fear that recall the figures of Antonio del Polaiolo. The clarity and the restraint, however, that we're seeing in these two Italian paintings were not the only formula for this subject. Another way to picture it was a scene of sheer confusion. In this woodcut by Hans Baldung Green, the men and the animals are packed together. Their agitation is increased by the compression and emphasized by the amazing web of cut lines that gives the picture such a kind of electric charge. The most ambitious treatment of this subject ever was Raphael's design for this tapestry in the Sistine Chapel, one of the series of 10 tapestries, each 9 feet tall, devoted to scenes from the lives of Saints Peter and Paul. These were hung only on special occasions, such as the conclave earlier this year to elect a new pope. Then they were brought out from storage and hung on top of the painted imitation wall hangings that you see in the picture. They were underneath the ceiling painted by Michelangelo with scenes of the Old Testament, and also beneath the band of very large frescoes of the New Testament by various 15th century painters. Raphael's designs for these tapestries, so-called cartoons, were commissioned in 1515, and the tapestries themselves woven in Brussels a little more than a year later. Garofalo was evidently in Rome just then, 1514 and 1515, and he might have stayed long enough into the following year to see some of these cartoons, including the one for this tapestry of the conversion of Saul. Garofalo's idea of Christ in the clouds is quite a lot like Raphael's, but otherwise the tapestry is completely different. Raphael gives a close-up view of a cavalcade of excited horses, of men running, Saul flat on his back with arms flung back in helplessness. Nearly 30 years later, Michelangelo, who was not to be outdone by his rival Raphael, painted the subject in the Vatican Palace in the new chapel ordered by Pope Paul III. Saul is shown as an old man with tremendous physique, surrounded by a teeming crowd of witnesses, some running away, some standing and twisting in opposite corresponding poses on either side of a single horse escaping and seen from behind. The sky is also teeming as Christ sends down light and sound as though he were Jupiter delivering thunderbolts. Painters and printmakers seized on Michelangelo's conception of a great physical drama and light show, and they produced many variants of it. These are just three of the many examples. By the way, these prints reproducing paintings introduce a theme that's going to recur in these lectures. The role that prints played in spreading pictorial ideas all over Europe. That shrank the Western world. That produced something like a kind of common visual culture, and it made the training of artists far richer and more sophisticated. For 4 centuries, reproductive prints did for art what photography would do in our time. We also saw in his later conversion scene by Garofalo how he responded to the fashion that you see reflected here for virtuosity, complexity, even perversity in composition. The so-called maniera, practiced by Giulio Romano and his generation, so praised by Vasari and practiced by Vasari later in the century, which became the dominant style all over Europe, as we'll see again next week in the case of Marco Pino. In Venice, the Tintoretto and Veronese painted the conversion of Saul as though it were a battle scene, recycling ideas from Titian, fitting Saul into a familiar framework of organized violence. The landscapes are entangled with the action. At about the same time, one Flemish painter invented a vision of the conversion that gave landscape a leading role, actually dwarfing the action. You saw this in the first lecture, if you were here. Peter Bruegel the Elder, puts a conversion into a vast mountainous landscape where an army labors slowly upward, and we're way off to the side, and we can hardly see what's going on right away, and neither can most people in the picture. You have to search to find it, and when you pick out Saul, you can see that his accident has caused other people simply to march on by. And there are just a few rays of light coming from the upper left to suggest that we're not witnessing, that we're witnessing a divine act. The point is that the scene here, the act, is not a private event, a private meeting of God and Saul. It's truly public. It affects everybody, even if they don't know it yet. And that its importance is as extensive, you could say, as the landscape is. The two most original and I think greatest paintings of the subject of the conversion of Saul do not picture it crowded with horses and witnesses. Instead, they're radically simplified. They show the event as a kind of private revelation. This astonishing picture by Parmigianino is about 6 feet high and was painted right about the time of Garofalo's picture here in the gallery. It shows Saul and his horse disturbingly close up, but just them, no Christ except for the golden rays at the top. We have drawings that Parmigianino made for this composition which gradually eliminate everything except this primal image of sudden upending, of pride taking a hard fall. Saul stares up blindly, dressed not at all as a Roman soldier, but as a civilian in peculiar translucent robes with strange wave-like folds that cling to his hefty arms and legs. Everything calculated to make us feel uneasy, from the weird bulrushes on the left side to the hyper-elegant horse with his teeny-weeny head and the white saddle skin here made from some kind of wild spotted feline. The artist treats the event as deeply uncanny. Caravaggio's picture, maybe the greatest of all, is just as strange, but in a completely opposite way. It's strange that it's so plebeian, so ordinary. Caravaggio's Saul is like Raphael's Saul, a soldier flat on the ground, helpless, again, arms flung up in astonishment. But that's where the similarity ends. We don't see any source for the light at all, and we see just how it rakes across the picture, across the Saul and across the horse. The attendant holding the bridle seems not to have seen or heard anything, and he's concerned only for the horse. And the horse is doing what horses do. He lifts up one foreleg so he'll avoid stepping on Saul. The event is like Parmigianino's in being stripped to its basic elements. The supernatural is present in the form of light that viewers can recognize from their own normal experience. The only thing out of the ordinary is that primal reversal of rider and horse. Horse up, rider down. Caravaggio painted another scene of the calling of a disciple, another completely unexpected turnabout. St. Matthew had been a tax collector called Levi. And in the Gospel of Matthew, Christ appears and says simply to him, "Follow me." Caravaggio imagines the worldly Levi in the customs house in raffish company, surrounded by good-looking boys in show-off costumes. He's responding with a gesture that says, "You mean me?" The beam of light on the wall answers the question. It points to Levi, reinforcing Christ's gesture of summons. And it divides the wall into dark and light, a painted metaphor for life before and life after, that once seen you never get out of your head. But to come back 75 years, Garofalo's recreation of the event uses some very effective devices, and it's worthwhile looking at them. And first of all, he isolates the main actors. He puts the crowd back in the far distance where they can't see Saul, but do react to something that they can't understand. That isolation emphasizes the personal, the private aspects of the event, just as we've seen in the work of other artists. And secondly, Garofalo implies that Saul has just emerged out of the dark forest into the light, possibly having been down on the road, having in the light, and then having gone into the dark and come out of the light, a kind of metaphor or prefiguration of his own temporary blindness. But anyway, the light and dark here are natural, frequent trope for enlightenment, which is the point of the picture. And third, there's the pose and expression of Saul, which I think, and no surprise here, he based on a figure by Raphael, not the Saul in Raphael's Tapestry, but another figure, this figure of the deceitful disciple Ananias falling down dead at Peter's command, a painting in the Vatican that was made too late for Garofalo to see, but which he would know for sure from this woodcut. I think it suggested to him Saul's twisting posture and the way he holds his arms and legs and head. And then there's Garofalo's quite unexpected idea of giving the horse and the rider similar poses. On the ground, both front limbs on the earth, twisting their heads upward, the shapes of the cloak, and the cloak and the hindquarters echoing each other. I think he intends us to consider that this man has not only been thrown from his horse, but also he's been reduced to a state every bit as helpless as his animal. And then there's this beautiful landscape, which looks something like the foothills of the Alps in the Veneto, a few days' travel north of Ferrara in Garofalo's time. Scenery that you see over and over in paintings by the Venetians that he admired as a young man. This small painting by Cima da Colignano is pretty typical. The hermit St. Jerome, who was supposed to be in Egypt in the desert, is rendered as a scene from home with fertile fields in the background, rocky outcrops, and a hill town quite a lot like Garofalo's. So to paint an event that happened near Damascus in a contemporary landscape is to suggest that these biblical stories are not remote, but they're relevant to viewers' own lives. It's to suggest that perhaps that it's in familiar places where the extraordinary happens. We saw last week how Pollaiuolo made the landscape of Tuscany a habitat for Hercules and a stage for his labors. It's a device that Garofalo uses consistently wherever the actual events, no matter where they might have happened in the story, to bring them home, to bring them into the here and now. Well, to summarize, Garofalo has used a great many techniques to paint an episode that's difficult to visualize. He picks the moment after Saul's unhorsing, in which Saul is receiving the message that will change his life and the lives of countless other Christian converts at the time, and still later, many millions of St. Paul's readers. I suggested earlier that Christianity aside, the picture and the story of Saul illustrates a more general truth that our lives always have the potential for a totally unexpected change of course, a change that's neither wished for nor deserved. The Latin word for this kind of abrupt course change is clinamen, an idea familiar in the Epicurean worldview put forward in Lucretius. In the last lecture, I mentioned the Florentine humanist Poggio Bracciolini and his discovery of a manuscript of a long-lost poem by Lucretius on the nature of things, De Rerum Natura, beautifully described by Stephen Greenblatt in The Swerve, a book in paperback that I strongly recommend to you. Greenblatt translates clinamen as swerve. It's a type of random change that's natural to a world of atoms that are continually in motion. Lucretius argued that that was the key, in fact, to free will. We know clinamen best as mutation, as a form of genetic change that's inexplicable to science. But it produces new characteristics or behaviors that can cause things to go off in a new direction. And things are never the same again. We know that this kind of random alteration is essential to the maintenance of life, to adaptation and survival. So, if you like, consider Saul's conversion in this light. In any case, the picture is a marvelously successful job of taking a familiar episode from a long, important story and telling it in strong, concise, memorable images. And the theme of sudden change, seen in any terms, whether it's divine grace or pagan philosophy, is worth taking to heart. Next week we'll look at another Italian Renaissance painting by the once famous Marco Pino of Siena. Like the Pollaiuolo and the Garofalo, it's a picture that illustrates a key moment in the story that the audience already knew. Subject is life and death, and life again. So we'll see the art of visual narration in this picture take another few steps forward, so please be here if you can be. Thank you.